Hey everyone, it's John, and on today's John's Briefs, we have Marc Victor back with us again from Attorneys for Freedom. I want to talk about an officer-involved shooting that was pretty grisly, a little crazy, engendered a lot of discussion on the main channel. So I want to talk about a couple of legal aspects of this particular officer-involved shooting. Number one, we want to talk about qualified immunity and what that means for officers versus private citizens. And then I want to talk about the duty to render aid as well. So let's talk about it. Today's video is brought to us by Firearms Legal Protection. Firearms Legal Protection is a legal defense program for lawful gun owners with a 24/7 emergency hotline and plans designed specifically for self-defenders. They are offering a discount on their plan to Ask fans, so hit the link in the description for that. Marc, always appreciate you being on the channel and kind of giving us some discussion on this stuff, man.
Great to be here. Fun stuff.
And Marc, if you didn't know, again, owns Attorneys for Freedom, is a member of the Firearms Legal Protection Network. And if you want to find out more about that, he's fantastic, one of the premier attorneys in Arizona. Attorneysforfreedom.com, best place for that?
Yeah.
Best place for that. Awesome. So I want to have you watch the video. It's a crazy one out of Louisville. And gosh, man, there's probably 40 rounds fired. And So we're not going to talk about who this guy was. He was an armed robber. He was armed with a firearm. He did discharge it at the cops. Probably the community's better off without him in it. But let's talk about, I want to talk, there was a lot.
Can I pause you there before you go any further? Because I'm a little skeptical about what you said. I don't know all of the facts here, but all I got was this is a guy who allegedly matches the description of an earlier armed robbery. I don't know. As a criminal defense lawyer, I like to know more about that situation first. Did he really match the description? What was the evidence given about what happened? I don't know, because if I don't have a good sort of nexus between that situation and kind of where we're running, then maybe the police acted improperly here. I mean, the video starts and I see this guy kind of running away from the police and police officers pulling a firearm, and as courts are concerned about really what level of knowledge did the officer have that this guy was a, what we'll call, dangerous fleeing felon to begin with, right? Because
so that's a good thing to talk about, right? So they got this place here, and there's, knowing this stuff, knowing, Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor are, I think most people don't know what the heck they're looking at here, because what we're seeing is a guy who is fleeing. We know that in an objective sense, by the end of that, they did recover his firearm that was right with him when he fell. It was discharged in the course of this. So you go, wait a minute, does an officer have a right just to shoot anybody who runs away from him?
Yeah, see, all of this I'm not saying that the officer did anything wrong here, and it may very well be the case that the officer acted perfectly appropriately, but I'm a little bit cranky about not having more facts here. I'd like to know more about the situation because, especially the two cases that you named, both civil cases, both situations where there was a claim of excessive force, and the question was really what standard of proof is to be used? How do we figure out whether the officer is really or said in the sort of language of these types of cases, did the officer violate the Fourth Amendment by using deadly physical force to stop this guy?
Right.
And I think the answer is going to be if the officer had enough facts that amount to an objective person considering that there's probable cause here to believe that this guy is armed and dangerous. I don't know if we had that or not, because I don't know what we had for this sort of call in on the description, or, I don't want to just sort of accept necessarily that this guy matched the description of an earlier call, therefore we can assume because he's running away and even because he had a gun, right? Because imagine for a moment this is not the guy. He sees the police. Maybe he doesn't like police from an earlier incident or something, so he's like, I'm getting out of here. And an officer starts shooting at him. Well, there are very careful rules about this, and generally speaking, you do not get to resist even an unlawful arrest. And this is the rule, I believe, in all states. So if the officer says you're under arrest, that's the end. You're under arrest. However, there can be a little escape clause there, like there is in Arizona, which allows an exception for, and in fact the language is, unless the officer is using more force than is allowed by law. Well, how much force is allowed by law? That can be the question. So there's some to talk about here about whether or not this was initially justified. My guess is It probably was, but I just wanted to flag that because I think that we all ought to pay more attention to getting more facts before we render a decision about especially complex and important issues like this one.
Sure, 100%. And when we see stuff on video, obviously we have a news story. We might have the prosecutor might put out something at the end. More and more are giving a full discussion of officer-involved incidents, and I think that's good and wise. And we can have that here, but just seeing what's on video, that's only one perspective and doesn't give us the whole story.
Yeah, we don't see an actual crime, right? What I see is a guy running away from the police, and the police officer pulls a gun and starts shooting, and I didn't see it, but apparently this guy shoots back. But even that doesn't necessarily rule out the fact that this could be a mistake here. And so this is why we need to have trials, right? This is why we have an adversarial system and we have defense attorneys and prosecutors, because facts need to be developed. And I think it's very important to say, especially to your audience, that we should not rush to judgment on these cases, because there's probably, and certainly in this one, there's a lot more that we didn't see and that we don't know. Different than, say, the other video that we've like the guy who smashes the windshield with the baseball bat. We saw that happen right there on video. We got the actual crime. This guy here, the video sort of starts in the midst of it. So with that little, maybe not so little, qualifier in there, I think we need to sort of tip the hat a little bit to, we don't know everything here. So what we're saying is sort of contingent on accepting as true that this guy indeed was involved in an armed robbery, and he is indeed an armed fleeing felon, and indeed this officer has enough facts to amount to probable cause to believe that this guy's a dangerous armed fleeing felon. And then if that's the case, now we're in business.
Now we're in business. Okay, so let's assume that from here. Okay, from a practical perspective, obviously, if you're not, like, let's just say you're a mistaken identity, the thing to not do is running from the cops does not end well often. Okay, you can outrun a cop, but you cannot outrun their Motorola. And they bring the whole crew with them, all right? And especially, listen, if a cop pops up and for some stupid reason you have a gun in your hand, the answer is not to run from the cops with the gun in your hand. It's a great way to get shot. And even if at the end of the day in the adjudicated case they were wrong and your family gets a settlement out of that, you're still dead, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah, we should recognize that indeed the world is filled with good police officers and bad police officers and all gradations in between. But in my estimation of dealing with police officers for almost a quarter of a century now, my opinion is that there's far more good police officers than bad police officers. So what does that translate to in this case? Look, if I'm this guy, I don't want to be a bloody mess on the ground like this guy was. I'm going to turn around and put my hands up and say, look, whether I'm the guy or not, I don't want to be shot. I'm going to put my hands up. I'm going to make myself safe. Some people will say, yeah, the police officer is going to shoot you anyways. That's the few and far in between police officer. Most of the time, anywhere in this country, you put your hands up, not all the time, but most of the time, they're not going to shoot you. And that's the safer course of action.
Can I qualify that just a little bit? So I've seen plenty with officers that a suspect will put their hands up, but that doesn't mean they're compliant. They're buying time for other things. So just putting your hands up doesn't mean much if you're not compliant. But I almost never see compliant people who end up getting physically harmed by police. To be compliant, you don't. So let's then come back and assume that that what we saw here was objective, reasonable. The officer, this was the guy. The officer had enough facts. This guy's running, gun in hand, and so we start going.
He doesn't have to actually have to be the guy. We just need probable cause to believe that he's the guy.
But okay, so that officer starts putting rounds down range, and we're in a residential neighborhood.
Yeah, this worries me right from the beginning, doesn't it?
And I think, the first officer camera, he went through at least a full magazine, got a second magazine in the gun, put some through that as well. Second officer shot through the glass, put at least 5 rounds through the glass, and then got out and put a couple more. So we're talking dozens of rounds in the neighborhood. Now that said, there's a difference between the standard of what an officer has to meet and what danger they can bring versus a private citizen, right? We call it qualified immunity. So what does that really mean?
We should try to unpack some of this. I would first say that we're into sort of policy questions about how police officers ought to act. This is a question for the chief, right? Like, for example, there are policies on things like high-speed chases. Even though the police can pursue, should they pursue, if it's going to create such a risk to sort of the civilian population? You could make an argument here and say, look, the idea of having this sort of battle royale in this neighborhood right around with, you know, picket fences and little houses and kids can come running around and there's stray bullets everywhere. I don't know. You might say maybe we don't do that right here and we follow this guy and we wait to try to get him at a different location. But the law doesn't say they have to do that. If maybe one of the stray bullets had hit somebody, maybe not, there's a civil case. But when we talk about things like qualified immunity, you have to remember something here. The king makes the rules, right? Okay. And the king makes all the rules, and the king generally makes rules that protects the king and the king's men, meaning the police officer.
Makes sense.
So like, for example, in Arizona, if an officer makes an arrest, say, that they shouldn't have made, they make a wrongful arrest, a mere negligence isn't going to be enough to have an action against them. You got to show that they did something with gross negligence, which is a much higher standard than is ordinarily applied to citizens, right? So if you act to do something and you do it in a way that is ordinarily negligent, which just means you acted in a way that was unreasonable given all the circumstances, you could be subject to liability. Police officers protected because they have to show gross negligence.
Gross negligence. So there's the difference in standard.
Different standard.
You or I, as private citizens, negligence is actionable.
Yes.
Whereas with a police officer, it requires gross negligence. Now, I'm going to say, as a private citizen, I actually don't mind that, because as a cop, I wouldn't be a cop if the city wasn't standing behind me. Now, of course, that's as long as they're acting within their training and within the policies of their department. Right?
Yeah, and of course there are policy questions here, right? It's just a matter of where you want to put the balancing test. One might respond to what you said and say, look, if an officer is to be judged by a reasonable officer standard and the officer did something that was unreasonable and that unreasonableness creates harm, maybe there should be an action. Because to say that there shouldn't, what you're really doing is you're depriving the person who suffered harm as a result of the ordinarily unreasonable police officer. You're saying that person can't recover. And I'm not 100% happy with that either. There's another side of the equation here. So, you know, people sometimes will ask me, Mark, are you pro-police or are you anti-police? The answer is I am very, very pro-good police officers, and I am very, very anti-bad police officers. There's a balancing test that has to happen here, and we need, you know, sort of as commentators, you and I, we need to call balls and strikes on these things. Sure. When the police get it right, we need to stand up and say we might not like it, it might look ugly, but they got it right. And a little distinction, sometimes I say they got it right under the law, but maybe the law should be changed here. And that's something I say often as well. When they get it wrong, we need to call that as well. We need to say, you know what, they got it wrong. And it's not just a matter of, I support law enforcement. I support a just result. And that should be our position.
Well, and I would say, me personally, I am generally pro law enforcement, but I'm never pro bad actor. I'm never pro, people making mistakes. I agree with you. I think most police officers, there's a preponderance for sure of good cops, and they work hard and they do a good job. Never for bad actors. And so what you said though kind of cued another question in my mind. My understanding of qualified immunity isn't that there's no action possible. So if an officer, and I'm asking an honest question here, I'm not an attorney, so I don't know the answer to this. That if there was negligence and an officer made a mistake because he was negligent, that qualified immunity doesn't mean no action can be taken, but that his department and therefore his city or county, whatever, is going to stand behind him in that liability.
Well, let me say it like this, a little bit deeper dive here. Historically, sort of at common law, right, when things were sort of getting started, the general rule was that the sovereign is immune from lawsuits. You don't get to sue the king.
Can't sue the king, okay.
You can't sue the king, that's the rule. So if the king has said, you can sue me, then the king gets to say, you can sue me, but only in these areas and only under these circumstances. So there are different varieties of qualified immunity. Like, for example, a judge has absolute immunity. A judge doing anything in their role as a judge, you can't sue the judge. Whether they made a mistake or whatever, they are just immune. They have absolute immunity. Prosecutors have a similar type of immunity. It's a qualified immunity. If they're wearing their prosecutor hat, unless they're doing something that they know is in bad faith, generally speaking, and these vary from state to state, so I'm speaking very generally here. Prosecutors have a qualified immunity, so police officers do as well. Some states say, look, you can't sue the sovereign. Others say you can under certain circumstances, like Arizona says gross negligence for a wrongful arrest. Other states can say, hey, we're going to eliminate that sovereign immunity thing completely, and you can sue us like you can sue anybody. Then there's a whole bunch of other things as well. Yeah. There's other, for example, many states, including Arizona, have extra hoops to jump through if you want to sue. Like, for example, there's a notice of claim statute, which can be very, very specific. You have to allege exactly what it is that you're saying the government did wrong. You have to do it within a very strict time limit here in Arizona. It's very short, 6 months, 180-day requirement. You miss it by a day, you're out. Those types of obstacles are often put up. So it's not easy to sue the government. And then, just to make it more complex, there are state rules on this, and then there are also federal rules on this, because the federal government, specifically Congress, said, look, we want to create a section to allow private citizens, through their private attorneys, to act as what they sort of referred to as a private attorney general for civil rights violations. So they created this section called 1983. You may have heard it, a 1983 violation. And this is the concept that in federal court, you can sue a state actor acting under state authority if they violated certain civil rights. They also provided a section for lawyers to get attorney's fees, because they wanted to encourage people, lawyers like us, and we do these cases, to bring them in federal court if there are civil rights violations. It's a very complex area of the law.
Well, and this one's come up several times in officer-involved stuff. The civil rights stuff is exactly what you're talking about, and we're hearing those a lot in the news today.
Yeah, they can be hard cases. But we can't be the attorneys for freedom without doing civil rights cases.
Yeah,
so that's why we do them.
So it's a complicated thing. Now, if you're not acting under the auspices of a department, so you're non-sworn, now all that's out the window. So if if you're shooting after a fleeing felon as a non-sworn, you're entering into a whole slew of problems. And I always recommend, if you are not sworn, don't do that.
Well, for starters, you better be right.
Right?
We're in a different circumstance now, because if you're going to use force against somebody you think you're going to make, let's say, a citizen's arrest, which you can do in Arizona and many other states, you better be right. And then there's the question of, what do you do after you make the arrest? You don't have your convenient jail to hold somebody. You have to be responsible for them. You have to feed them and clothe them, and you got to bring them somewhere and turn them over, and all this has to be done in a way that comports with due process. This is why almost all lawyers, including me, say don't do that. Yeah. Leave it. Just don't. If you're forced into a situation like that for whatever reason, fine. It may be the case that a criminal defense lawyer like myself might use that as a defense. Hey, he was making a citizen's arrest. Fine. But don't go out there playing cops and robbers, this is why we have our agents, the police, to go do this stuff for us. They're the ones who are trained. They've got the skills, the tools, the backup, all the supporting cast. Don't go making citizens arrests.
And of course, then, if you choose to do that, and you choose to chase a fleeing felon, you choose to shoot, and you miss, well, now you can be liable for any damage that's caused by that miss.
You're going to be liable for any damage caused by that miss. So it's really fraught with peril. And, again, it's what we've talked about in some other videos. It's sort of the moral duties versus the legal duties. You don't have a legal duty to make the arrest. Do you have a moral duty to chase down a bad guy? Maybe. But that's the decision we all make individually.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk about here, I said earlier, was the duty to render aid. So after they got this guy in custody, they put him in cuffs, and then the officer started rendering aid. Now, of course, in the video, you can see they're far more interested in rendering aid to the officer who thought he might have been hit. Turns out he wasn't. But by and large, I do see police officers, after they get a suspect in custody, especially if they shot him, start rendering aid. Is that a legal duty to render aid if you've shot someone?
Yeah, the police are going to have that duty to render aid because they shot the person. They put the person in that position. They got to do everything they can do to try to get them help, to get them medical attention. I mean, they have custody of the person. And once you have custody of the person, there are certain due process requirements that are federal courts have said, look, when you have a citizen in custody, because even this guy he is presumed innocent.
Sure.
He is definitely presumed innocent. So now you've got a guy on the ground who's presumed innocent. You have reasons to arrest him, I assume, based on our earlier statements. But you got a guy who is presumed innocent, and if this presumed innocent thing means something, and it ought to mean something, then they got to treat him that way. They should treat him like he's presumed innocent. Give the guy medical attention, even after he's convicted. If indeed he's convicted, there are still due process requirements to deliver food and shelter and health services. It's not going to be the best, but it's minimal thresholds. And lots of times governments don't comply with that either.
Now, what about a non-sworn? So somebody like you or I, God forbid, we had to use our firearm in self-defense. Is there a legal duty there to render aid?
If you put somebody in a position, like we've talked about in some of the other videos, you better render aid. You better do what's reasonable. And even if you make your citizen's arrest, you are still handling somebody who is presumed innocent. This is why it's so fraught with peril, right? There is I could probably say that almost any citizen's arrest that's made, there's probably going to be some basis of liability against the person who made the arrest. Maybe not in all cases, but you really take on a major risk when you do that kind of thing.
So now this is in particular, are you speaking of me chasing a fleeing felon and taking him as a citizen's arrest?
Yeah.
Now let's just say I didn't do that. Some crackhead wanted to shiv me with a screwdriver and take my wallet, and I said, no thanks, I drew a gun and shot him. He scampers off and I run the other way. Do I have a duty to render aid to him?
Well, you're acting in self-defense.
Yeah.
So I can't think of any reason in that circumstance why a citizen would, but I can tell you this is why we almost always advise people to make sure 911 is called. It doesn't have to be the person who did the shooting, but I like a call to 911 by somebody that at least minimally conveys there's been a shooting or a stabbing or something. There's a man down. Here's the address. Please send help. Bye-bye. And then, of course, keep in mind that generally people with badges are going to show up, and they're going to be excited. So the next smart thing to do is to make sure you do not in any way appear to be a threat, because we don't want any kinds of accidents. So I always advise people at that point, wherever your gun is, get it far away, get your hands up, get on the ground, make yourself a non-threat no matter what the situation is. Because police officers, we should recognize they do have hard jobs. If they want to go home and their attitude is going to be, I'm not good. This isn't going to be my last call. I'm going home tonight. So understandably, they're going to show up to a shooting case with guns drawn and heightened excitement, and everybody's going to be put on their face. You have to be prepared for that, and I would say have some understanding about why officers act like that.
So what we saw here is, just wrapping it up, from the medical side, officers, once they have somebody in custody, and he's in custody, he's in cuffs, and so he's secured, now they have a duty. They have a duty to do a reasonable amount to take that person and keep them healthy. If we decide to chase a fleeing felon, or if we decide to make a citizen's arrest, we kind of enter into that same level of responsibility. Now, if we're just defending ourselves against a criminal act and are not trying to make a citizen's arrest, then probably much less in that instance. You guys all know on Aspects, I've talked about this. I carry a first aid kit. I don't carry a first aid kit primarily for somebody who would hurt me, but for me and for mine, if God forbid we were hurt. But you got to recognize what those are, guys, and these kind of things are the kind of important discussions to have. So, Marc, I really appreciate the information, man.
And one other thing to add, you could imagine with you rendering your first aid kit right after a self-defense shooting or something, the question probably would be asked, why didn't you call the ambulance to get somebody who was qualified there to render aid? And if the person dies because you're putting Band-Aids on wounds because you're not a trained guy in this area, you're going to be sued. It's just a better all around to just make the call. It's not a good time to start giving information about what just happened, right? Because you got to know a good, qualified, competent 911 operator is going to keep you on the phone and ask you lots of questions. And that's going to be rule number one that we being criminal defense attorneys like to reiterate to everybody. Keep your mouth shut. This is not the time to start talking about what just happened. It won't be used against you. You tell your lawyer what happened, and then you make decisions from there.
Right. Amen. Good stuff, guys. A lot to talk about here, and so let's keep the discussion rolling. And again, Marc, if they want to find out more about you, attorneysforfreedom.com. Lots of good stuff there. So hope you have a great day, everyone.